If you're just joining the series for the first time, don't worry. Each of these webinars is designed to be a standalone presentation, so you'll be able to follow along pretty easily, even if this is your first time with us. If you do want to review the first 3 webinars from the series, though, they're all available on YouTube in their entirety. We're recording this webinar too, so it will be uploaded to YouTube shortly so that you can watch it again or share it. And now I'm really excited to introduce my colleague, Tricia Cervenan, a senior product manager here at Globant. Hi, Tricia.
Hello.
Tricia has almost 10 years of exceptional product management experience and has really valuable information to share with all of you. Whether you've just broken into the field, are a veteran product manager like she is, or just want to learn more about what she and others in her role do. In this webinar, Tricia is going to be exploring Eric Ries's original definition of a minimum viable product, or MVP. She'll explain how product managers' interpretations of Ries's original concept have morphed since he first discussed it in his book, The Lean Startup. Tricia will then dive into a more nuanced explanation of MVPs and offer up a new interpretation of the term. If you have questions along the way, that's awesome. Please use the Q&A feature on the panel to ask them. I'll be monitoring questions throughout the presentation, and then there will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, during which time I'll pass all of your questions along to Tricia. She may not have time to answer all of them, but we'll get to as many questions as we can. But Tricia can explain all of this a lot more clearly than I can, so without further ado, I will hand things over to her. Take it away, Tricia.
Thanks, Lisa. Hello, everyone. I'm super excited to talk about this today. This is one of my very favorite topics. So rather than keep going on intros, let's just get started. So the thing that we're going to make sure that we try and achieve by the end of this webinar is we'll be able to explain what an MVP is, and then we'll be able to discuss how to design an experiment for a given problem. So the first thing we need to do is we need to talk about what is an MVP. What is a minimum viable product? Because we want to make sure that we have a baseline agreement amongst all of us on what this is. So the question is it a version of a product with a stripped down feature set? So does it have less features? Are we releasing with maybe not everything we want? Are we releasing with maybe there's a couple of bugs that only some people will hit or some people won't hit? Is it something where maybe we haven't built everything within each feature? So it's sort of an incomplete feature as compared to our vision of what this product is. And so let's go into what Eric Ries says to try and answer that question. So in the Lean Startup, so Eric Ries popularized this term in 2008 when he released that book, The Lean Startup. And so how he defined it was, he said, an MVP is that version of the product that enables a full turn of the build, measure, learn loop with a minimum amount of effort and the least amount of development time. If you go to his website now today, if you haven't read the book or can't get access to it or whatnot, don't want to read the whole book, but you can go to his website and it says, first, the definition. The minimum viable product is that version of a new product that allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning about customers with the least amount of effort. So that version of a new product that allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning about customers with the least amount of effort. I'm going to leave this up here and just pause for about 10 to 15 seconds and let you read this just to make sure that you're sort of internalizing. Okay, so what he does after he has puts out those definitions in the book, then what he goes on to is explain his definition by giving us some examples. And examples are great because it really helps us to understand the nuances of what he's talking about. So his first example in there is Dropbox. And so what he says is, well, Dropbox, they thought that there was this need out there to make file sharing easier. And so what they did was they created a video before their product was built about what their product might look like. So they sort of faked it. And then they put a landing page out there. And so when folks went to the video, they watched the video, and then they went to this landing page. And what Dropbox did was they tracked signups for beta access to Dropbox once it was ready. Then what he talks about is this company called Aardvark. And so Aardvark, they're a company that they had several hypotheses about what their company should focus on. They had all these ideas and they weren't sure what to do, and they weren't sure what might make it in market. And so what they did was they said, well, we're going to release software prototypes every 2 weeks. Whatever it is we can create in 2 weeks, that's what we're going to release, and we're going to see what gets traction. And then food on the table. So food on the table, they had this hypothesis that they thought that people had a desire to save money at the grocery store by planning out their meals. So they could save money if they just planned, and that people did all this work on their own, and food on the table could help make it easier. And so what they did was they printed out recipes and meal plans and then handed them to customers every week. And they did all this before any software was built. So each week they went and they handed out recipes and they handed out meal plans, no software. And so you have this definition that talks about these products that are being built, build, measure, learn, loop. And then he goes on to have these examples, and it becomes a bit confusing as to what this phrase, this term, minimum viable product, actually means. And so the result is that we have a really wildly misused term that everybody has different definitions for. And so if we think about his examples, they're all products. Everything that was built, whether it be the video and the landing page, or whether it be those software prototypes, or whether it be what Food on the Table did with handing out paper, they're just not mass marketable software products. And so if we can agree, for the sake of at least this webinar, but hopefully going on after we leave this webinar, that a product doesn't have to be mass marketable to be a product, so that we can understand what an MVP really is, then we can talk about why we need to use them. So we use minimum viable products to disprove our hypotheses. So if we go back to the definition, Reese says, well, it allows a team to collect a maximum amount of validated learning. So that's to disprove a hypothesis. And it's about customers, a maximum amount of validated learning about our customers. So that's to learn if there are customers. And then with a minimum amount of effort. And so that's to avoid waste. And the least amount of development time. And that's where we're talking about if there's a problem worth solving, because development time is costly, not only in money, but also the opportunity cost of doing that versus something else. And so the least amount of development time, is there a problem worth solving? So I took a little bit of liberty and wrote a new definition for an MVP that I think might be a little bit clearer. And it's really just taking what Reese says with his examples and with what I believe to be his intent, and just sort of taking out the word product and being a bit more explicit. So an MVP is a testable solution to a problem that's used in an experiment that can generate an objective right or wrong answer in a given amount of time with the least amount of time and development waste. So it's a testable solution to a problem. It can be used in an experiment that gives us an objective right or wrong answer, and we're going to do it in the least amount of time with the least amount of development waste. And so if we go with that definition, then what we're saying is that a minimum viable product is not necessarily a traditional version 1. Rather, it's a solution that we can use to run an experiment. And so the key takeaway here is going to be that an MVP is a testable solution to a problem. And so when rather than necessarily version 1, so we want to make sure that we're defining what we mean when we use the term MVP. And we want to make sure that we're asking others to define what they mean too, because there are so many different versions, and not everyone, unfortunately, is on this webinar today to have our shared understanding. So let's go a bit deeper onto why we use MVPs. This is my favorite example of why. Of why. So some folks have probably heard of Tidal. Tidal is the music service that is out there, owned by Jay-Z and company. And it was a music service that was released in 2014 by a Swedish music company that was trying to get into streaming. So they had other properties, other things they were doing, and they wanted to get into streaming because it was, you know, the new hotness. And so what ended up happening was Jay-Z had this vision for digital music distribution, and he didn't like Spotify, didn't like Apple Music, didn't like any of them. And so he was like, him and his collective, they said, Tidal's the place where we can go and we can build our vision for what digital music distribution is. And so he paid $56 million US dollars for this. And he thought, well, if we offer higher quality audio on a service that pays artists more and promises better music discovery, users are going to pay a premium for it. And so they relaunched Tidal at $20 a month with lossless audio, as opposed to the compressed audio and the lossy audio that the other services had. Well, as it turns out, when they released this product, people didn't care enough about paying artists more and higher quality music and better music discovery to pay $10 for it, $10 extra for it. And so when they could get all of that with competing services for cheaper. I mean, because if you think about it, right, most users aren't out there you know, really listening to audio with amazing speakers. We have our, you know, our Apple earbuds or our you know, earbuds that come with our phone. Sometimes we go into Bose listening, you know, using Bose or Sonos or those types of products. But again, we maybe aren't necessarily listening for this quality of audio. And so Tidal ended up releasing a new version shortly after that, for $9.99, and it had lossy quality, just like every other service. So its main value proposition didn't work out. And so if you think about what is the time, all the time and money that the folks at Tidal spent building this infrastructure for this higher quality audio, that had to have cost a fortune. Not to mention all the things that they were doing. In addition to building that, just to be able to promote this as, you know, higher quality audio and paying artists more. And so the company even went through 3 CEOs on its way to discovering whether or not it could obtain product market fit. So imagine if the folks at Tidal had gone and done an MVP or run an experiment rather than just going with their own opinions. Of themselves and their friends in music, they probably could have saved a lot of time, money, and public goodwill. So let's make sure that we figure out if our users will use our product before we build it. That is why we use an MVP. MVPs can help us reduce risk in time, money, and effort of building the wrong thing. It can help us to build smaller tests so that we can learn faster if our users are going to use our product, or if they'll use parts of it, or if some things are hard or not needed, they don't solve their problem, rather than building out full-fledged products. And we get to know whether or not we're successful, because we're gonna measure it. We're gonna have tangible, objective answers about whether or not these things happen. So test until you can figure out what users are gonna pay for. People often ask me, well, how many tests should we run? You keep running tests, test after test after test after test, until you figure out what users are willing to pay for. Okay, so how do you do this? How do you use an MVP to run an experiment? The first thing I always tell people is to start with a hypothesis. You want to know what you are trying to test, and you want to know what you are trying to test specifically, very specifically. So if you think about tests or experiments that are run in medicine, they're not just saying, well, hey, will this drug kill people or not? No, the drug has to perform better than a placebo on solving a particular ailment. And so there is a defined objective of this project. And so it's not just, well, do people like it? It's, does it do X? Are they able to achieve Y more than before they had it, before using whatever alternative currently exists in market or doesn't exist? And so how do we write a hypothesis? There are tons and tons and tons of examples out there. I really love the hypothesis version that came from Jeff Gothelf in Lean UX. And so I like to recommend this one. I think it's really clear. And so the hypothesis statement goes like this. We believe that solving this problem or creating this experiment or experience for these people or these personas will achieve this outcome. And we will know this to be true when we see this measure in this time frame. And so it may seem like a little bit of extra work to take the time to write out this hypothesis. But what I found is that if you don't do this, if folks in product don't do this, and they just have this sort of vague notion of, I want to see if this works or not, or if users like it, unfortunately, that's just not specific enough. And so it's hard to tell if you've achieved anything, if you've done what you set out to do. And so being explicit really helps to make sure that your test has been valuable and that you haven't wasted your time or users' time or your team's time. And so using your hypothesis, then you want to ask the question, how can you test to prove or disprove the hypothesis? So imagine if these companies, if that had made these products, if they had tested until they learned what users were willing to pay for. All of these products had value in the world for something. Unfortunately, users weren't willing to pay for it because it wasn't enough value or it wasn't the type of value or they weren't ready for it. And so sometimes we get really caught up in our own desires and our own wants and the things that we find really compelling and important. And it's really hard to see outside of that. And so that's why having a hypothesis with a measurement can really keep us honest and keep us focused on the fact that we're trying to build a company or a business or a market for our product. And you don't need to build software to run an experiment. That is key. You do not need to build software to run an experiment. So let's talk about some very specific types of minimum viable products that are out there. And this will illustrate how we don't have to use software. And so starting with remembering that we're having a specific hypothesis to know what we're testing, then we can use that because we have our hypothesis to know which one of these tests might work. So the first is what's called a concierge MVP. And so this is what Food on the Table did. So this is my favorite example of an MVP because the folks at Food on the Table did not build any bit of software until they figured out what customers were willing to pay for. And so what they did was they went to a grocery store in their area and they found a customer who was willing to give them money. Essentially, they pitched one customer. They actually pitched multiple people, but it was until they found someone who's willing to pay them. And so they pitched these customers, and then someone and said, "This is what we're going to do for you. This is how we're going to help solve your problem." And the customer was like, "Sure, I will give you X dollars a week for you to do this service for me." And so what they did was they interviewed her and they asked her a bunch of questions, and they went back to wherever it was they were working, and they created a meal plan. And they looked at the ad for that particular grocery store to figure out what was on sale. And then they came up with a shopping list based on the meal plan for this customer. And then they went back at the end of the week and they gave all of this printed out paper to the customer. And then they let this customer go shop around the store. And they followed this person and took notes on what happened. And then they did it again next week. And they used their learnings from following the shopping experience and the feedback. And they they made iterations, and they continued to do this. And then once they felt really confident that they had the product for this person, they understood this person a lot, then they went and got another customer, and they did the same thing. And so they continued to iterate the product and continued to talk to these 2 customers, and then 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, until they got to the point where they were they couldn't sustain doing manual work like this, of printing out paper anymore. They couldn't sustain that. And so they built software for the parts they couldn't sustain. And the product eventually became a big software product with algorithms that looked at grocery stores and compared them based on your meal plans. And Food on the Table sold for a whole bunch of money to Scripps Network, and is now what's called food.com. So that's Food on the Table. The concierge portion is they very much did manual work for these customers, rather than having anything be automated. It was personalized service. Wizard of Oz, sometimes confused with concierge, but a bit different. So the founder of Zappos, what he did when he was creating Zappos was he created a website. So he knew how to code, and he created a website, and he put pictures of shoes on there. And then what happened was, anytime that a shoe got ordered, he would go to the store, like a physical retail store out there at his local mall, and buy the pair of shoes and then ship it to the customer. And so he wasn't holding on to a bunch of inventory, and he wasn't holding on to a bunch of automated shipping processes and algorithms and things of that nature. Instead, he created a very simple website that allowed some easy access, and then went and did all of this work on his own. And the Wizard of Oz portion is, to the user, it looked like it was a full-fledged website with all of these automated processes, and it was huge and big. It was a big deal, but really it's one person behind this going out and doing all of this manual work. And so think about this for your business or your products that you're working on. Is there something that you can put up that makes it look like it might be a thing, like a full-fledged product with back-end services, but really once the user does something, there's a whole bunch of people behind the scenes, or one person behind the scenes making it happen. Landing pages. So landing pages are great for MVPs. They tend to be used in conjunction with another type of MVP. What's really great about these is you can measure the number of people that are willing to pay for something, or at least are interested, before you ever build any bit of software. There are so many tools out there to get a landing page up and running really, really quickly. And the key with a landing page MVP is to make sure that you have someone give over some bit of information, not just a click, but to give over some bit of information that makes them invested. So whether that be an email address, or whether that be they have to pay for something, but some way to indicate that they are invested in this. And that can tell you whether or not there's actual interest. And so going back to that Dropbox example that we talked about earlier, what Dropbox did was they had this idea that that file sharing was really, really hard, and that they could create this new type of file sharing product out there and make it really easy for people to go back and forth between different computers. And so what they did was they created a video. They did not have a product built. They might have built a little bit of it just to fake the video, but essentially it was a video of screen sharing. And so the founder was sort of showing what Dropbox might be in the future once it was built. And he put a link to, so he made the video, put it up on YouTube, and then put a link to it on Reddit, and found like a group of people that he thought might be really interested in this. And he said, here's this video, that of new file sharing, and inside the video there's also, you know, a couple of Easter egg jokes that the Reddit community might find to be really interesting. And then he used a landing page and said, hey, if you're interested in this and you want to see more about this, go to getdropbox.com and sign up for the beta. And what he found was that there was a need and there was a desire for the product in the way that he envisioned it, because he had showed people beforehand what it might be before he ever built anything. Very controversial MVP type called a feature fake. Google loves these. And this was actually clipped from a presentation on SlideShare by Jeff Gothelf and it's showing Flickr did it. So this particular one, on the left side, you'll see all those images. So what happened was, this was on Apple TV. It was the Flickr app. And over on the right side at the very top, they put a link that says use a screensaver. And so when users clicked on use as screensaver, they then got the screen on the right side that says screensaver functionality is not available at this time. But hey, we've recorded the fact that you are interested in it. And so the idea with this is they didn't build it at all. All they did was build the little link that says use as screensaver and then this other error message. And they were tracking how many people even went and clicked on use as screensaver. It's to give them some idea about whether or not there's any interest at all in this. And so Google uses this a lot. They use it a lot, particularly in docs and spreadsheets and all the Google apps when, like the business apps, when they knew they had a lot to do to get people to get it to be comparable with what Microsoft had done with Office. And so they needed to order the work. And so they put a ton of feature fakes within docs and spreadsheets so that they could see which ones people tried to access more, knowing that those were the things that they should go and build first, rather than trying to build everything or building the wrong things. And then folks aren't using docs because they're like, I can't do this one thing that I really, really need to be able to do. And the final sort of culmination of them all, of all the types of MVPs, are going to be crowdfunding. So crowdfunding, particularly on Kickstarter, you make a video, you have a landing page, and you have a button that says, hi, I'm interested, and people give you money. And so this is a great way to, if you're building something new, particularly something physical, but it could also be for software, where you're really showing people what you might build and gauging their interest by how much money they're willing to put on the table. And so even if you happen to have the funding to be able to produce this, it's a really great way to see whether or not people are committed to you, are committed to this product, that you should take the time and effort to go through and build this product. And so those are all examples of how you can run an experiment. And I hope that that all of this helps you to talk to your teams and talk to your clients and talk to the folks that you're working with about the idea of building something that is cheap and or inexpensive, that doesn't have to be software, that's measurable and specific, and helps us get to validated learning faster than spending 3, 6, 9, 12 months building software that maybe isn't going to make it out there in market. All right, I think that means it's time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tricia. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions during the presentation. We've had a lot of really great questions come in that I've been keeping track of, so I'm ready to pass them on to Tricia. If you have questions as we go, please feel free to continue submitting them using the Q&A feature, and if there's time, we will get to them. Tricia, are you ready for your first question?
Let's do it.
All right. The first question is, how much time and effort would be viable for working with the MVP before trying another strategy?
So I think that question has two parts to it. So I'm going to go a bit broader on that question than I think what was asked. I think an MVP, you should be able to build an MVP in 2 weeks or less. If it takes longer than 2 weeks to build your MVP, it's too big. So I think that 2 weeks is like the maximum amount. I actually really try and do 1 week, but 2 weeks is the absolute max. How long should it go on before you do something else? That depends on your success metric. So making sure that in your hypothesis that you have defined a metric that we must achieve X by X. So if we go back to that lean UX hypothesis where it said we're going to achieve this number in this amount of time, that's a specific measurement. That's how long you go. And if it doesn't achieve that number, whatever number you set out to do in that time, then you need to pivot and do something else. And I think it's without having those numbers in that time frame, and we talked about this a bit in the metrics webinar, so I'd say go back and watch that if you want to learn more about it. But I think it's really easy for folks to succumb to the sunk cost fallacy, particularly if they've spent a bunch of time building something that took longer than 2 weeks. Says, well, I spent so much time doing this, I need to keep going. And the thing is if you do something that is doesn't take that long and isn't that expensive in time, money, effort, and you know exactly what you're trying to achieve, it's a lot easier to say, you know what, that didn't work, let's go try something different.
That actually transitions really well into another question that we received. Mm-hmm. When should you pivot from the MVP that you've created? How do you identify that critical point at which it's time to just change gears or try something new?
Yeah, so that is exactly the exactly what I just said, which is because you've defined your metric and your time frame for your metric, that's the point. The point at which when you've achieved it or when you haven't achieved it in that time frame, if that has come and gone, that's it. Pivot, do something different. Now, how close you got to your metric might tell you how much you need to pivot. Or so if let's say your metric was you wanted 400 signups in 2 weeks, and let's say you got 397 signups in 2 weeks, that's pretty close, but it's not it. And so you might say, okay, well, we need to pivot something. So let's go talk to some users. Let's go figure out exactly why people aren't signing up. And then you're going to pivot just a little bit. If your goal is 400 signups in 2 weeks and you've gotten 4, then you probably need to pivot a lot and do something drastically different because there's very little interest in comparison.
Awesome. Well, thank you for clarifying that.
Of course.
There's another question that has to do, you've mentioned setting metrics beforehand before diving
Mm-hmm.
into the MVP. How do you go about defining those metrics and specifically how do you decide how much time you're willing to spend on the development and implementation of your MVP?
Yeah, so as far as development and implementation of the MVP, like I said, I think 2 weeks is a great amount of time. Anything bigger than that, you should rethink how you might achieve the goal. I think 2 weeks is a good ballpark. Or a good line in the sand. As far as how you choose your numbers, so again, I'd say go back to the webinar we did on metrics for a more thorough explanation. But really, it comes down to your business or your market. You should have done some research to define or to realize that this problem exists. And that's going back to our very first webinar of the series about defining our problems. And so, enough about the fact that this problem exists and there's something in market. And so really, you should be able to look at either competitors or at something you've done with your product before or something in your company. It could be based on if we don't get this number, then we have to quit because we can't keep going. We, have to go get new jobs, or we have to go, if we're starting our own business, like we have to go get a full-time job, or we can't, our time is worth this much. And so it may be like, this is the amount we need from each customer to be able to continue moving on, to make this worth it. And sometimes when it's something super greenfield and the thing that you're trying to do is way out there, sometimes you're just guessing. You're just guessing to get some baseline, some number that you can start to analyze on as you continue to iterate on your MVPs. And so it might be that you throw some number out there and say, we need to get this. Okay, well, at least we have a hypothesis of a thing we're trying to achieve, and we're trying to get this. And if we don't get that, then at the end of our test in the time frame we think is right, then we're going to go back and figure out why didn't we get that. And at least we have a direction to ask questions about with our users, a direction to pivot to, rather than it just being like, well, people didn't like it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Got a lot of questions coming in, so we'll just keep moving right along. The next question is the MVP a mandatory outcome or milestone for any project?
So I think that MVPs are great, and I really advocate for them. As we saw with Risa's explanation, his view was that an MVP is for any new product, and so I'd say that's where it's probably more. It's more likely that we can go with that absolute of yes, it's mandatory. Anything that's new, anything that we don't have enough information about, that we need to reach some market fit or validate that users are willing to pay for it. When we talk about basic optimizations, maybe not. Sometimes we know enough to just sort of go for it, and it makes sense to just go for it. But again, it's really what is the cost of just going for it? How much time and effort are you going to put in to building something if you could test it first to see if it's right? And so like the Google examples with their feature fakes, the MVP really helped them order their work, and really they knew they had to do it because something already existed, and so they might have had teams working on those things, but that MVP really helped them know where to allocate their resources. And so I advocate for them all the time, running experiments and constantly testing. And I understand that sometimes some projects in some businesses, when you already know enough information, if you could just get it out there in a week and a half, 2 weeks, it might make sense to just build it and call it a day.
That actually transitions really well into a related question. Do you have a standardized process for teaching or educating your clients about thinking about a hypothesis or using MVPs to validate them? The person who asked this question said, I assume that many clients want to just start building software right away.
Yeah, so, working in consulting, we have a challenge of, at the end of the day, our clients often will hire us to have this outcome, and they want to build this thing, and so they know the thing they want to build, and so that's the thing we're going to build. What we can do, though, with clients or even our stakeholders, if we're not working in consulting, is we can still try and form a hypothesis that has metrics in it, and it might be for the full product, and we might need to have to keep going on and building this thing depending on where we're at in the company and how much authority we have and influence over other people. That's just a reality, and so what we'll want to do, though, is still, while we're doing that work, let's define what our success metric is, and let's define what our goals are, and let's define what our assumptions are. Because then as we're building, when it comes up that this thing's wrong, or this doesn't seem right, or somebody changed their mind, or somebody has a different opinion about that thing, what we can do is we can at least measure all of those things against that hypothesis and against the thing, that goal, and that we thought that we might achieve, and that data that those metrics we're trying to get to. And that can at least help us to get through that process. At that time, you're also teaching your clients or your stakeholders that there are other ways to go about building software, and that there are other ways and other things we can do. And on top of that, sometimes going back to what I was saying earlier, is when questions do come up or ideas do come up and there are all these competing opinions, one thing you can do is you can say, hey, let's test that and let's run a quick 1 day, 2 day, 3 day test on whether or not this might work. Again, that all depends on whether or not it's feasible or not, but that's an option. Rather than going with a bunch of opinions, let's test it and see what happens. So I've done that before. And I think that really just helping to educate folks along the way by showing them what you might do in ways that they might solve the problems the next time really helps them to trust you that that in the next project, running an experiment might help them get to their answer faster and easier than the 3 months or 6 months that this project took to build.
So Tricia, you talked a little bit about client relations and how they can be maybe a bit of an obstacle sometimes in building an MVP. Someone wants to know how you deal with internal conflicts when you're trying to build an MVP. They talk about someone in their customer support department who's not totally on board with MVPs, other members of the team who might not think they're necessary or who have differing ideas. How do you resolve internal conflicts during this process?
Yeah, so I think it's the thing that I've learned about people is that people all have their own motivations. And so they all have their own reasons about why they don't like something or why they want to do something in a specific way. And it doesn't always coincide with what we think their motivations might be. So one of the things we talk about in our product coaching offering is we go through this whole segment about intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. And so I'd really recommend doing a whole ton of reading on that. But folks have motivations, though they might want to have a great product out there, they also might believe that if X feature doesn't get built, they might get fired. Or if X feature doesn't get built, they're not going to get promoted. Or they have heard from 7 customers that they're willing to pay X amount of dollars if that feature got built. And so they have these motivations that they don't always share right away because people are willing to share things that are easy and not necessarily things that are intrinsic or deep down motivating them. And so I think the best thing you can do to get past that is to really build your relationships with the folks that you're working with and really understanding that this is about them. It needs to be about them if you're trying to convince them that this is a path forward. The other thing is they might not understand what an MVP is. Remember that this is a wildly misused term, and there's so much controversy about what this term means. They might think it means stripped down feature set. They might think that you want to spend 6 months building an MVP, when really what you're talking about is 2 weeks. And so I'd also say, in addition to really learning and understanding their values and what motivates them so you can respond to those things, also showing and illustrating what you might do. Hey, you know what? I wrote this hypothesis and I think we can run this test in 2 weeks. Let's do it in conjunction while also starting the thing that you think we should build that is going to take 6 months. Let's also do this test. And I think we can do it without building any software. So we don't need to use the development team other than maybe for 5 hours on this one day. So let's do it at the same time and let's get some answers while we're moving forward here. And then when you show them that you're able to do short iterative tests that run, that help to achieve their goals and help them get to their motivations faster, I think that they're going to come on board. And again, people are hard. People are really hard. And so really forming and building those relationships is going to be your strongest approach.
Awesome. Thank you, Tricia. We probably have time for one more question. So One of the last questions I think that's come in is,
Yeah.
how do you identify when the MVP is the issue and not the idea that you're trying to test? How do you know where the problem lies?
Yeah, so if the MVP is the issue, your test will show it, because you have metrics, right, that shows this solution is not the right solution. And so remember that your MVP is supposed to be designed off of your hypothesis. You're not building an MVP and then writing a hypothesis. And so it's not just, hey, we're building the idea. It's what is the problem we're trying to solve? And that's what our hypothesis is based on. And so your solution should be built on the idea of, how do I prove or disprove this hypothesis? Oftentimes, I think what folks do is they have an idea and they just build the idea and they put it out there in market, whether it be to a small number of people or a large number of people, and they call it an MVP and they say, I'm going to see how many people use this. What this methodology is really saying is that we're going to identify what problems exist, and we're going to figure out whatever solution out there it is, whether it be the first one you came up with or the 20th one you came up with, what solution is the right one to solve that problem. So you'll know that your MVP is wrong when it fails, when it doesn't meet the metrics that you said that it should meet.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you again, everyone, for your questions. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So if we didn't have a chance to get to your question, please feel free to get in touch with Tricia and ask her any lingering questions that you have, or any questions that popped up during the course of the Q&A session. We really appreciate how many of you have participated. It's really encouraging for us. And we appreciate the back and forth, the discussion. It's been really great. So this wraps up the fourth and final webinar in our product management series. Remember that each of these webinars are available on YouTube, so you'll be able to watch them or share them anytime you like. If you have any additional feedback, or again, like I said, any questions for Tricia, maybe they're questions about product management, about the series, maybe if you have questions about our product coaching offering, please go ahead and send her an email. But again, thank you, everyone. We've really enjoyed putting this series together, and we hope that you've gotten a lot out of it. We hope that this webinar series has given you tools to be a better, more effective, and more confident product manager. Again, please feel free to get in touch, but that wraps up this webinar. So thank you so much for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you, Tricia.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Take care.